The beginning of the end. The grand halls of the Harrington Manor gleamed with an aura of extravagance. David Harrington, the billionaire mogul who had spent the last 3 decades building a business empire, sat behind his massive mahogany desk. The sunlight streaming through the crystal-clear windows barely seemed to touch him. Outside, the sprawling estate radiated beauty and luxury, but inside, David was consumed by a cold detachment that even the warmth of success could not thaw. The stack of legal documents before him seemed to weigh more than all his assets combined. David's decision to end his marriage with Emily had been brewing for months. Once partners in every sense, he now felt trapped in a routine he could no longer tolerate. Emily had been his anchor, steady and resilient during the tough years when his company was just an idea. She had shared the burdens of late-night brainstorming sessions and the terror of near bankruptcy. But now that the storms had passed and he stood atop his mountain of wealth, David found himself yearning for something else, something he thought Emily could no longer provide. Across the room, Emily sat silently, her eyes downcast yet dignified. She had sensed the growing chasm between them long before David mustered the courage to put it into words. He had grown distant, coming home later and later, his excuses growing thinner with each passing day. Deep down, Emily knew about Samantha, the young, vibrant woman who had captured her husband's attention. But Emily's pride wouldn't let her beg or grovel. Instead, she remained composed, even as her heart fractured under the weight of betrayal. "I never thought it would come to this," Emily whispered, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice carried a note of sadness, but also a quiet strength that caught David off guard. "It's for the best," David replied, rehearsing the detached tone he had practiced in his head. "We've grown apart." Emily looked up, her eyes searching his face for a flicker of the man she had once loved. But all she saw was a stranger, a man who had already moved on. With a steady hand, she signed the divorce papers, each stroke of the pen feeling like a blade slicing through the remnants of their bond. The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, David's life transformed into the dream he thought he always wanted. He married Samantha, a woman half his age who embodied everything he believed he craved: youth, excitement, and the thrill of a new beginning. Together, they traveled the world, indulging in lavish vacations, extravagant parties, and the kind of hedonistic lifestyle that made headlines. But even as David basked in his newfound freedom, a subtle emptiness began to creep in. Samantha's vibrant energy, once intoxicating, started to feel overwhelming. She seemed more enamored with his wealth than with him, constantly pushing for more diamonds, more yachts, more attention. And as David poured himself deeper into work to maintain their lifestyle, he found himself longing for the steadiness Emily had once provided. Meanwhile, Emily had disappeared from his world. After the divorce, she moved into a modest apartment, taking only what she needed to start over. David convinced himself that she was better off without him, though he never checked to confirm. His pride kept him from acknowledging the guilt that gnawed at the edges of his mind. A chance encounter. 2 years later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, David was rushing through downtown to attend a high-stakes business meeting. The weight of the day bore heavily on his shoulders. His company was facing challenges he hadn't anticipated, and cracks were beginning to show in his meticulously crafted empire. As he passed by a small park, something caught his eye: a figure sitting on a bench, surrounded by children. He stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat as recognition dawned. It was Emily. She looked different yet the same. Her hair, once styled perfectly for gala dinners, now fell loosely around her shoulders. Her clothes were simple but elegant, a reflection of the woman he had always admired for her quiet grace. But what truly stunned him were the 4 children clustered around her, quadruplets, identical in every way, with striking blue eyes that mirrored his own. David felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. Quadruplets. His mind raced with questions. How? When? Why hadn't she told him? He stood frozen, unable to move as memories of their life together flooded his mind. He thought of the nights they had dreamed about starting a family, the plans they had made before his ambition took over and consumed everything. The confrontation. Later that evening, David found himself standing outside the modest apartment building Emily now called home. The grandeur of Harrington Manor seemed like a distant memory as he climbed the narrow staircase, his heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and anticipation. When Emily opened the door, her expression was one of calm surprise. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter without a word. The apartment was warm and inviting, filled with the laughter of children playing in the next room. It was a stark contrast to the cold, sterile luxury David had grown accustomed to. "You never told me," David began, his voice strained. "How could you keep this from me?" Emily met his gaze with unflinching resolve. "You didn't ask," she replied simply. "You walked away, David. You moved on without a second thought. By the time I found out I was pregnant, you were already building a new life with her." Her words struck him like a blow, each one a reminder of the choices he had made. "They're my children," he insisted, desperation creeping into his tone. "I have a right to know them." Emily shook her head, her eyes filled with sadness. "You had your chance, David. I raised them alone. I gave them everything they needed. You don't get to waltz back into their lives now just because you feel guilty." David's shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. He looked around the apartment, at the framed photos on the walls, the toys scattered on the floor, the signs of a life he had missed entirely. For the first time, he saw the cost of his ambition, not just in dollars and cents, but in love, trust, and the family he had abandoned. The turning point. As David left the apartment that night, he felt an unfamiliar sensation, vulnerability. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and dominated headlines now felt small and uncertain. The empire he had built suddenly seemed hollow, a facade that masked the emptiness inside. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he vowed to find a way to make amends. What he didn't realize was that the journey ahead would test him in ways he had never imagined, forcing him to confront not only Emily and his children, but also the man he had become. The cost of abandonment. As the days unfolded after David's shocking discovery in the park, the image of Emily surrounded by the quadruplets haunted him. He couldn't shake the piercing blue eyes of the children who looked so much like his own reflection. Each night, as he lay in his cavernous bedroom, David was consumed by questions he couldn't answer. How had he overlooked such an enormous part of his life? And how had Emily managed to raise 4 children on her own? David attempted to bury himself in work, but his concentration faltered. For the first time in years, the spreadsheets and stock updates that had once been his lifeblood seemed meaningless. His assistant, Robert, noticed his distraction but knew better than to pry. Samantha, on the other hand, grew increasingly impatient with his distant behavior. She thrived on his attention, and his emotional absence left her restless. "David, you're barely present these days," Samantha said one evening as she swirled her wineglass. They were seated at a private dining table in one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, but David's eyes were fixed on the flickering candle between them. "Is this about work again? You need to let the board handle things for once." David shook his head, unwilling to share the truth. Samantha wouldn't understand. She thrived in a world of surface-level connections and extravagant distractions. The thought of explaining his inner turmoil to her felt exhausting. Instead of answering, he murmured, "I need to step out for some air," and left Samantha staring after him, her lips pursed in irritation. Facing reality. Determined to confront Emily again, David found himself driving back to her modest apartment the following afternoon. He sat in his car for what felt like an eternity, staring at the building and debating whether he had the right to invade her life once more. Finally, he summoned the courage to step out. Emily opened the door, her expression unreadable. "You again," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "What do you want this time, David?" David hesitated, uncharacteristically unsure of himself. "I need to talk to you, Emily. About the kids. About everything." Her gaze softened slightly, but her posture remained guarded. "Fine, but only because the kids are napping. I won't have them dragged into this mess." David followed her into the apartment, noticing the warmth of the space once again. The walls were adorned with photos, images of the children at various stages of their young lives. Birthdays, holidays, moments of pure joy captured in still frames. He felt a pang of regret realizing he hadn't been there for any of it. Emily gestured for him to sit at the small dining table. "Say what you need to say, David." He took a deep breath. "Emily, I was a fool. I walked away from you, from everything we built together, chasing something I thought I wanted. But seeing you and the kids, it's made me realize what I've lost." Emily's eyes narrowed. "You didn't just walk away, David. You tore apart our family. You chose wealth and excitement over love and stability. And now, after 2 years, you suddenly think you can waltz back in because you're having a crisis." Her words cut him deeply, but he couldn't deny their truth. "I know I made mistakes," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "But I want to make it right. I want to be a part of their lives, Emily." Emily leaned forward, her voice firm but not unkind. "David, do you even know what it takes to raise 4 children? The sleepless nights, the endless sacrifices. While you were jet-setting with Samantha, I was here, alone, trying to keep everything together. You have no idea what you left behind." The wall between them. David's attempts to reconcile were met with resistance. Emily had every right to protect her children from a man who had abandoned them before they were even born. Still, David persisted. He started showing up at the park where she often took the children, hoping to catch glimpses of their laughter and energy. He wanted to understand their world, even if from a distance. One afternoon, as Emily sat on a bench watching the Quadruplets play, David cautiously approached. He brought a small gift, a set of storybooks he thought the children might like. Emily eyed him warily, but allowed him to sit beside her. "These are for the kids," David said, handing her the neatly wrapped package. She took it, but didn't open it. "You can't buy their love, David. And you can't erase the past with gifts." "I'm not trying to buy their love," he replied earnestly. I want them to know me, to know their father." Emily sighed, her resolve wavering for a moment. "Do you even know their names?" she asked pointedly. David froze, shame washing over him. He hadn't thought to ask during their previous conversations. The realization hit him like a blow. He was a stranger to his own children. "No," he admitted quietly. "But I want to. Please, Emily, give me a chance." She studied him for a long moment, the tension between them thick and unyielding. Finally, she said, "Their names are Lily, James, Grace, and Noah. But don't think that knowing their names means you've earned a place in their lives." Samantha's growing discontent. As David tried to navigate his way back into Emily's life, his relationship with Samantha continued to deteriorate. The carefree, glamorous facade of their marriage began to crumble under the weight of his guilt and her dissatisfaction. One evening, Samantha confronted him as he returned home late. "Where have you been, David? Don't tell me you've been at work again." David hesitated, knowing she wouldn't take the truth well. "I've been trying to reconnect with my past," he said carefully. Samantha's eyes narrowed. "You mean Emily, don't you? And those kids? Are you seriously choosing them over us?" "It's not about choosing," David replied, his frustration boiling over. "It's about doing what's right. Something I should have done a long time ago." Samantha scoffed, tossing her glass of wine onto the floor. "You're pathetic, David. You've lost your edge. The man I married wouldn't waste his time groveling for a family he abandoned." Her words stung, but David realized they no longer held power over him. The life he had built with Samantha was hollow, a glittering shell that masked the emptiness inside. For the first time, he saw her for what she truly was. A reflection of his own worst choices, a new resolve. David knew the road ahead would be difficult. Emily had every reason to keep him at arm's length, and his children had grown up without him. But he also knew he couldn't give up. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a need to rebuild what he had destroyed. As he left Samantha for the final time, walking away from the mansion that had once symbolized his success, David felt a strange sense of liberation. He was no longer the man who valued wealth over love, ambition over family. He was a father, a man determined to earn back the trust and love of the people who mattered most. The journey was just beginning. But for the first time in years, David was ready to fight, not for deals or profits, but for his family. Steps toward redemption. David's resolve to reconnect with his children fueled his days, but the path ahead was strewn with obstacles he hadn't anticipated. For years, he had lived in a world of boardrooms and luxury, where deals were closed with handshakes and problems were fixed with money. But now he was faced with a challenge that required something money couldn't buy: trust. An awkward beginning. David's first attempt to interact with the children was an awkward affair. Emily had begrudgingly allowed him to visit the park where the Quadruplets played after school, but her instructions were clear. You can watch, but don't overwhelm them. They don't know you, David. When he arrived, David felt out of place. The park was alive with the sounds of children laughing, parents chatting, and the rhythmic creak of swings. His suit, though tailored perfectly, felt out of sync with the relaxed atmosphere. He spotted Emily sitting on a bench, a book in hand, while the children raced around the playground. Each child was a miniature version of him. Lily, with her determined gaze, led the group like a little general, her pigtails bouncing as she climbed the jungle gym. James followed closely, his quiet demeanor giving way to bursts of curiosity as he inspected bugs on the ground. Grace, the dreamer, was twirling near the swings, lost in her own world, while Noah, the youngest by mere minutes, was enthusiastically trying to keep up with his siblings. David approached Emily hesitantly, carrying a small bag of snacks he had brought as an olive branch. Emily glanced up, her expression guarded but not hostile. "You're on time," she said simply. He sat beside her, watching the children. "They're incredible," he murmured, his voice tinged with awe. Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she closed her book and fixed him with a steady gaze. "You can't just show up and expect them to embrace you, David. They've lived their entire lives without you. Don't confuse curiosity for acceptance." David nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I know, but I have to start somewhere." The first interaction. After some time, Emily called the children over. They approached reluctantly, their expressions ranging from curious to cautious. Emily introduced him simply. "Kids, this is David. He's someone important I wanted you to meet." David knelt to their level, his heart pounding. "Hi, guys," he said softly. "I've been really excited to meet you." Lily crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Why?" David hesitated, caught off guard by her bluntness. "Because I've heard so much about you. Your mom tells me you're all amazing kids." Grace tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "Are you Mommy's friend?" David glanced at Emily, unsure of how much to reveal. "I hope to be," he said carefully. "But I'm also someone who wants to get to know you better." James and Noah stayed quiet, their eyes darting between their mother and David. The tension in the air was palpable, but David didn't push. Instead, he handed them the bag of snacks. "I brought these for you. I wasn't sure what you liked, but I hope this is okay." Lily inspected the bag, her skepticism giving way to a faint smile as she found her favorite chocolate bar. Grace giggled as she pulled out a pack of gummy bears. James and Noah remained cautious but eventually joined in. Emily watched the exchange, her arms crossed. While she didn't say anything, David noticed the flicker of approval in her eyes. A harsh reality. Despite the small victory, David's road to redemption was far from smooth. The next few weeks were a roller coaster of progress and setbacks. He showed up consistently at the park, sometimes bringing books to read with the kids or small toys to share. Slowly, they began to warm up to him. But Emily remained distant. One afternoon, as David helped Noah build a sandcastle, Lily approached him with a question that stopped him cold. "Why weren't you here before?" David froze, the plastic shovel slipping from his hand. He looked up to find Lily staring at him, her piercing blue eyes demanding answers. I made mistakes, Lily, he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. I didn't realize how important you all were until it was too late. Lily frowned, her small hands on her hips. That's dumb, she said matter-of-factly. Mom says we don't need people who don't care about us. David felt the sting of her words but nodded. She's right, and I didn't care the way I should have. But I care now, Lily. More than you know. Lily studied him for a moment before shrugging and walking away. Though the exchange was brief, it left David shaken. He realized that rebuilding this family would require more than just showing up. It would demand vulnerability and honesty, traits he had buried beneath years of ambition. The cracks in his new life. As David tried to bridge the gap with Emily and the children, his life with Samantha continued to unravel. Her patience for his newfound priorities wore thin, and their arguments grew more frequent. You're spending all your time chasing ghosts, Samantha snapped one evening. You have a new life now, David. Why are you so obsessed with the past? David stared at her, his frustration boiling over. Because the past is the only thing that matters now. I walked away from a family that deserved better, and I won't make that mistake again. Samantha scoffed, rolling her eyes. You're pathetic. Maybe you should have stayed with your perfect little wife and those kids if they meant so much to you. Her words, meant to wound, had the opposite effect. They crystallized David's resolve. He realized that Samantha represented everything he wanted to leave behind. The shallow pursuit of pleasure and status that had led him to abandon his family in the first place. That night, David packed his bags. Samantha didn't try to stop him, and as he left their penthouse, he felt an odd sense of relief. He was finally free to focus on what truly mattered. A chance at forgiveness. David's decision to leave Samantha was a turning point. He began dedicating more time to understanding his children's needs and proving to Emily that he was serious about being in their lives. He attended their school events, learned their favorite hobbies, and even took parenting classes to better connect with them. One rainy evening, David found himself at Emily's doorstep again. She opened the door, her expression wary. What do you want, David? To apologize, he said simply. For everything. For leaving, for hurting you, for being blind to what I had. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to make things right. If not for us, then for the kids. Emily studied him for a long moment before stepping aside to let him in. As they sat at the kitchen table, she listened as David poured out his heart, his words raw and unfiltered. For the first time, Emily saw not the arrogant businessman who had abandoned her, but a man humbled by his mistakes. I don't know if I can ever forgive you completely, she admitted, but I can see you're trying. And maybe that's a start. David nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. Thank you, Emily. That means more than you know. As the evening wore on, they talked not as ex-spouses, but as two people striving to rebuild what had been broken. It was a fragile beginning, but for David, it was a glimmer of hope, a chance to reclaim the family he had lost and to prove that he was worthy of their love. Facing the shadows of the past, David Harrington had started to make small inroads with his children and Emily, but the journey to redemption was far from over. Each step forward came with the weight of the past pressing down on him, a past he could not change, but could only hope to reconcile. As the days turned into weeks, David found himself confronting not only the consequences of his decisions, but also the deeper reasons behind them. For the first time in his life, he began to question the man he had become and the values he had once held dear. A surprise visit. It was a chilly Saturday morning when David decided to surprise Emily and the children at their modest apartment. He carried a box of cupcakes he had picked up from a local bakery, carefully chosen to match each child's favorite flavors, which he had painstakingly learned over the past few weeks. Lily loved chocolate with sprinkles, Grace adored strawberry, James preferred plain vanilla, and Noah couldn't get enough of red velvet. As he climbed the stairs to their apartment, he rehearsed what he would say. He hoped this gesture would show Emily that he was serious about being a consistent presence in their lives. But as he knocked on the door, he felt a familiar pang of anxiety. What if they didn't want him there? What if Emily saw this as an intrusion rather than a genuine attempt to connect? The door opened, and Emily stood there, her expression a mix of surprise and caution. "David, what are you doing here?" "I thought I'd stop by with something for the kids," he said, holding up the box of cupcakes. "I hope it's okay." Emily hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. "They're in the living room. You can give it to them." As David walked in, he was struck by how different this place was from the sprawling mansion they had once shared. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with warmth and laughter. The walls were adorned with the children's drawings, and the shelves were lined with books and toys. It was a stark contrast to the cold, sterile luxury he had surrounded himself with in recent years. The children looked up as he entered, their faces lighting up when they saw the cupcakes. "Dad!" Noah exclaimed, rushing over to hug him. The other three followed hesitantly, their expressions ranging from excitement to skepticism. "I got these for you," David said, kneeling down to hand them the box. "I hope I got the flavors right." As the children dug into the cupcakes, Emily watched from the doorway, her arms crossed. She didn't say anything, but David could sense her guarded approval. He knew he still had a long way to go, but moments like this gave him hope. The weight of the truth. Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, David and Emily sat in the small kitchen, sipping tea. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people have too much to say but don't know where to start. "Why now, David?" Emily finally asked, breaking the silence. "Why are you trying so hard to come back into our lives?" David set his cup down, his hands trembling slightly. "Because I've realized how much I've lost," he said. "I spent years chasing success, thinking it would make me happy. But all it did was make me blind to what really mattered. I left you and the kids for something I thought I wanted, but it turned out to be empty. And now, I just want to fix what I can." Emily's eyes softened, but her expression remained cautious. "You can't just fix this with cupcakes and apologies, David. The kids might be excited to see you now, but they don't understand the depth of what happened. And as for me, I don't know if I can ever trust you again." David nodded, his throat tightening. "I understand. I don't expect forgiveness overnight. But I'll keep showing up, Emily. I'll keep trying." She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching. "I hope you mean that," she said quietly. "Because if you let them down again, it'll break their hearts. And I won't let that happen." A humbling experience. David's efforts to rebuild his relationship with his family extended beyond cupcakes and visits. He started volunteering at the children's school events, helping out at bake sales, and attending their soccer games. Each interaction was a humbling experience, a reminder of how much he had missed and how far he still had to go. One day, as he helped Lily with a science project, she turned to him and asked, "Why didn't you stay with us, Dad?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He paused, struggling to find the right words. "Because I made a mistake," he said finally. "I thought I needed something else to be happy. But I was wrong. I didn't realize how much I already had until it was gone." Lily studied him for a moment, her young face filled with a wisdom beyond her years. "Mom says people deserve second chances, but only if they work for them." David smiled faintly, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. "Your mom is a very smart woman." Confronting the past, as David continued to spend time with his family, he couldn't ignore the mess he had left behind in his professional life. His business was still struggling, and his reputation in the corporate world had taken a severe hit. He decided to take a step back from the company he had built, handing over the reins to a trusted colleague. It was a painful decision, but he knew it was necessary. He needed to focus on what truly mattered. One afternoon, As he packed up his office, he came across an old photo of himself and Emily from their early days. They were standing in front of their first apartment, smiling and holding hands. The sight of it brought a lump to his throat. He realized that the man in the photo had been happy not because of wealth or success, but because of love and partnership. David placed the photo in his bag, vowing to carry it as a reminder of what he was fighting for. A glimmer of hope. One evening, David invited Emily and the children to dinner at a small family-owned restaurant he had discovered. It was a far cry from the lavish establishments he used to frequent, but it was warm and inviting, with a menu that reminded him of home-cooked meals. As they sat around the table, laughing and sharing stories, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he felt like he belonged. He still had a long way to go, but this moment gave him hope that he could rebuild what he had lost. As they left the restaurant, Emily turned to him and said, "You're doing better, David. But remember, actions speak louder than words. Keep showing up." David nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I will," he promised, "every day." And for the first time in a long time, he truly meant it. The seeds of trust. David Harrington's life had shifted dramatically. From the grandeur of lavish boardrooms to the humbling reality of a small apartment and community events, he had come a long way in understanding what mattered most. However, while his intentions were becoming clearer, rebuilding trust, especially with Emily, remained an uphill battle. She had seen too many empty promises and heard too many hollow apologies in her life to believe anything without proof. An invitation to the world he left behind. One crisp morning, David was folding laundry in his modest apartment, an activity that felt strangely therapeutic when his phone buzzed. It was an email from a former business associate, an invitation to a high-profile gala celebrating entrepreneurs and industry leaders. The invitation promised a night of networking, luxury, and recognition. David stared at the email, conflicted. This was the world he had once thrived in, a world that had fueled his ambition and driven him to make the decisions that tore his family apart. But part of him saw an opportunity, a chance to show Emily and his children that he was no longer defined by material wealth or prestige. Perhaps this event could be a way to bridge the gap between the person he used to be and the man he was striving to become. He called Emily that afternoon, his voice cautious but hopeful. "Emily, I received an invitation to a gala next weekend. It's a formal event, and I was wondering if you and the kids would join me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "A gala?" Emily's tone was skeptical. "David, why would you want to take us to something like that?" "Because I want to show you that I'm not ashamed of the life I'm living now," David said earnestly. "I'm not the same man who left you for a world of wealth and power. And I want to introduce you and the kids to the people who mattered in my old life, the people who should know what truly matters to me now." Emily hesitated. She had no interest in rubbing elbows with the wealthy elite, but something in David's voice told her this was important to him. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Preparing for the night. The week leading up to the gala was a whirlwind. David wanted to make the evening special, but he was also determined to stay grounded. He rented suits for James and Noah, and found elegant yet modest dresses for Lily, Grace, and Emily. For himself, he chose a simple black suit, nothing flashy, just enough to blend in without drawing attention. Emily, still hesitant about the event, found herself touched by David's efforts. He didn't just buy expensive clothes and expect her to wear them. Instead, he asked for her input, making sure she felt comfortable and respected. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about how much he had changed. On the night of the gala, David arrived at Emily's apartment to pick them up. When she opened the door, he was momentarily speechless. Emily stood there in a navy blue dress that accentuated her natural beauty, her hair cascading in soft curls. The children, too, looked radiant and excited, their eyes wide with anticipation. "You all look amazing," David said, his voice full of genuine admiration. "Thank you for coming with me tonight." Emily offered him a small smile. "Don't make me regret it." A night of contrasts. The gala was held in an opulent ballroom adorned with glittering chandeliers and elegant floral arrangements. As David and his family walked in, heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. David Harrington, once a titan of industry, now a man surrounded by his ex-wife and children. David felt a pang of anxiety, but pushed it aside. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to prove to himself and his family that he had nothing to hide. Throughout the evening, David introduced Emily and the children to former colleagues and business associates. Some offered polite smiles, while others struggled to mask their surprise. But one interaction stood out. A former investor named Richard approached David, his tone dripping with condescension. "David, it's been a while. I didn't expect to see you here, and with company." His eyes flicked toward Emily and the children. David smiled, refusing to rise to the bait. "Yes, Richard, this is my family. Emily, my ex-wife, and my children. Lily, Grace, James, and Noah." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Ex-wife. Well, that's unconventional." Emily, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "It's not unconventional to value family over wealth, Mr. Richard. David has been working hard to rebuild what truly matters." Richard blinked, clearly taken aback by her poised response. David felt a swell of pride. Emily's strength and grace had always been her defining qualities, and he was grateful to see them shining through. A lesson in humility. As the night wore on, David found himself reflecting on the people around him. He saw himself in many of them, ambitious, driven, and blind to the costs of their success. He realized how much he had changed and how much he still had to learn. At one point, Lily tugged on his sleeve. "Dad, can we dance?" she asked, her eyes shining with excitement. David hesitated. He hadn't danced in years, and the thought of stepping onto the dance floor in front of so many people made him nervous. But then he looked at Lily, her face full of hope, and he couldn't say no. He took her hand and led her to the dance floor, where they swayed awkwardly to the music. Soon, James and Noah joined in, followed by Grace. Even Emily allowed herself to be coaxed into a dance. For a few precious moments, the Harrington family became the center of attention, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder of what true wealth looked like. The aftermath. As the gala came to an end, David and his family stepped outside into the crisp night air. Emily looked at him, her expression softer than it had been in years. "You did well tonight," she said quietly. "But this is just one night, David. Consistency is what matters." "I know," David replied, "and I'm ready for the long haul." As they drove back to Emily's apartment, the children dozed off in the back seat, their faces peaceful. Emily turned to David, her voice barely above a whisper. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like you're trying, for real this time." David's throat tightened, but he managed a nod. "I am, and I won't stop." That night, as he lay in his own bed, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. The journey toward redemption. The days following the gala felt like a turning point for David Harrington. The night had been both humbling and inspiring. Emily's words echoed in his mind. Consistency is what matters. For David, the challenge was no longer about regaining his fortune or impressing others. It was about proving to Emily, his children, and himself that he was capable of being a better man. But change wasn't easy, and David knew it would take more than grand gestures to rebuild trust. He needed to be present, reliable, and selfless, a far cry from the man he had been. A father's promise. David began by making small but meaningful changes. Every evening, he showed up at Emily's modest apartment to spend time with the children. He didn't arrive empty-handed, not with expensive gifts, but with simple things that mattered. A box of puzzles for Grace, a soccer ball for James, a stack of coloring books for Lily and Noah. At first, The children were hesitant. While they enjoyed his presence, years of absence had left a gap that couldn't be filled overnight. But David didn't give up. He helped them with homework, cheered them on at their weekend soccer games, and spent hours playing board games at the kitchen table. One evening, as David was helping James with his science project, James looked up and said, "Are you really staying this time, Dad?" The question stung, but David nodded, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere, James. I promise." James studied him for a moment, then gave a small, tentative smile. It was a start, and for David, it was everything. Emily's walls began to crack. While David's efforts with the children were slowly bearing fruit, his relationship with Emily remained strained. She appreciated his involvement with the kids, but maintained her distance, wary of being hurt again. David didn't push. He knew she needed time. One afternoon, Emily found David sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by the children as they worked on a giant jigsaw puzzle. The sight of him laughing with them, his once pristine suit replaced by a worn sweater and jeans, tugged at something deep inside her. "David," she said quietly as the kids ran off to grab snacks, "why are you doing all this? You could have just walked away." David looked up, his expression earnest. "Because I'm done running away, Emily. I spent years chasing things that didn't matter and ignoring the people who did. I'm not that man anymore. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I want to prove to you that I'm here. For good." Emily didn't respond immediately. She had heard promises before, but there was something different about David now. His words felt less like a plea and more like a vow. A community reclaimed. As David spent more time in Emily's neighborhood, he began to immerse himself in the community. He volunteered at the local food bank, helped coach James's soccer team, and even joined a neighborhood cleanup initiative. The once arrogant billionaire now found fulfillment in small acts of service. One day, while handing out groceries at the food bank, David overheard two volunteers discussing an upcoming fundraiser for the community center. They needed funding for repairs but were struggling to secure donations. David approached them, an idea forming in his mind. "What if we organized a charity auction?" he suggested. "I can reach out to some old contacts and see if they'd be willing to contribute." The volunteers were skeptical at first, but David's enthusiasm won them over. Over the next few weeks, he poured himself into the project, leveraging his connections to gather auction items and rally support. Emily watched from the sidelines, impressed but cautious. She had seen David throw himself into big ideas before, only to lose interest when the novelty wore off. But this time was different. David wasn't doing this for recognition or profit. He was doing it for the community, and for his children, who were watching him closely. The auction that changed everything. The night of the charity auction arrived, and the community center buzzed with excitement. David, dressed in a simple suit, stood at the entrance, greeting guests with a genuine smile. Emily arrived with the children, her heart conflicted as she watched David interact with the crowd. He seemed more at ease than she had ever seen him. The auction was a resounding success. Items ranged from handcrafted furniture to signed memorabilia, and the bids far exceeded expectations. By the end of the night, they had raised enough money not only for the community center repairs, but also for additional programs for local children. As the event wound down, David took the stage to thank everyone. "This community has given me something I didn't realize I needed. A sense of purpose," he said, his voice steady. "I've spent so much of my life taking, but tonight, I'm proud to give back. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this." The applause was thunderous, but what meant the most to David was the look on Emily's face. For the first time in years, she seemed to truly see him, not as the man who had left, but as the man he was becoming. A family reunited. Later that night, as they walked home together, Emily broke the silence. "You've changed, David," she said quietly. "I don't know if I'll ever fully trust you again, but I see the effort you're making. And it means more than you know." David stopped, turning to face her. "I don't deserve your trust yet," Emily, but I'm willing to spend the rest of my life earning it. Emily studied him for a long moment before nodding. We'll see. It wasn't a declaration of love or forgiveness, but it was a start. The first steps toward a new beginning. In the months that followed, David continued to rebuild his life, not as a billionaire or a mogul, but as a father, a neighbor, and a man determined to make amends. He secured a stable job that allowed him to support his children without returning to the high-stakes world of corporate ambition. He and Emily co-parented with mutual respect, and while their relationship remained platonic, there was a growing sense of camaraderie between them. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner at Emily's apartment, Lily looked up from her plate and said, "I like it when we're all together." Emily glanced at David, a small smile playing on her lips. "So do I," she admitted. David felt a surge of hope. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. And that was enough.